Agora nós vamos ter a apresentação do Adam Zimmerman. Ele já está aí? Já está com a tela. Obrigado, Adam.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Can you see my slides?
Yes, that's okay.
Great, so I will start my 20-minute timer now. Eu vou falar em inglês, só quero agradecer rapidinho em português todos os indígenas da terra indígena Rio Branco, do sul de Rondônia, a liderança política das comunidades indígenas da terra indígena Rio Branco, inclusive o Dalton Tuparí, vereador eleito em novembro, se não me engano, o primeiro político indígena no município de Alta Floresta do Oeste. A todos os professores indígenas que ensinam a língua materna nas escolas da terra indígena Rio Branco, a área de linguística do Museu Paraense Emílio Gueldi, Vilaci, Dene, Hein, sem vocês, tudo isso não teria sido possível. Aos meus professores na Universidade de Chicago, aos participantes de SILA em janeiro e WISCLA 2 dias atrás, e as instituições que tenham possibilitado financeiramente a minha pesquisa de campo, the National Science Foundation, the Jacobs Research Funds, the Endangered Language Fund, the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Chicago, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Eu vou falar em inglês. So many members of the Tupian language family exhibit alternations at the beginning of a closed class of stems, nominal stems and verbal stems. Such alternations may be between a consonant and nothing, or between 2 or more different consonants. So here's a set of examples from the Mawe language, where you can see that depending on what kind of pronominal prefix is present, you're getting a surface alternation between and also in terms of whether there's an NP possessor present, a non-pronominal possessor, or no possessor at all. And much of the traditional literature on the Tupian language family refers to these alternations as relational prefixes, the idea being that the underlying segments here are actually synchronically segmentable morphemes whose distribution can be defined morphosyntactically. The Tuparí language, which I've been working on since 2013, has been described in these terms. So you have nominal stems like ob for father, which when possessed by a non-pronominal possessor appear with an H. So iob, his or her or their father, versus tigi hob, tigi's father. But there are also plenty of nouns like arob, thing or food, which show up without any kind of epenthetic H. Due to this distribution, Tuparí has traditionally been described as having 3 different noun classes, determined by whether or not an H shows up in the case of a non-pronominal possessor. So koepa, moon, and, so epa for oyu, for I, ape for path, do not take an epenthetic H, whereas the word for leaf does. And then the distribution of the 3rd person pronominal prefix is orthogonal to that. So you have a distinction here and a distinction here, and the traditional description is that there are 3 different synchronic noun classes. The Tuparí data have been analyzed as being conservative retentions that go all the way back to Proto-Tupian, on analogy with comparable alternations attested in the Tupi-Guarani languages. And recall that on all classifications of Tupian, the last common ancestor of Tupi-Guarani and Tuparí was Proto-Tupian itself. So if this really does reconstruct, it's a very old alternation. My objective in today's talk is to show you that basically Tuparí has been misdescribed. The analysis that's been put forth and has been cited in the diachronic literature is simply not sustainable when a broader range of synchronic facts are taken into account. What I'm going to show you is that that H is not a morpheme that gets inserted, but is rather a stem initial consonant that's deleted. This will turn on basically an elsewhere principle argument. Based on the extant description from the 1950s, the idea was that the H was inserted in a morphosyntactically well-defined set of environments. Once you take a broader view and look at a much wider range of verbal paradigms, you see that it's basically impossible to succinctly specify where the H shows up. It's only possible to specify where the H is missing. And for that reason, I'm going to propose a straightforward deletion rule that is morphophonological in nature. Morpho because it only takes place after a specific set of morphemes, namely the vowel final pronominal prefixes. When one of these alternating stems is immediately linearly after one of these 5 prefixes, you lose the H and you get the H everywhere else. The proposal I'm going to show you today accounts for a range of phenomena that either weren't described before, or if they were described, were stipulated as synchronically irregular. I'm going to show you that it all falls out from the deletion rule in 3. All right, so here are the basic facts to resumir. So a word like ausi, wife, does not show an epenthetic H. A word like daughter, ag, does show an epenthetic H. So you have a contrast between 4a, okio ausi, and 5a, okio hag, where there's an H only in the latter. I should note that I try to maintain a gender balance in the examples I show. None of the female kinship terminology shows the relevant alternation. The word for child of a woman, grandchild of a woman, husband, none of these words show the relevant alternation. So you'll be seeing a lot of male possessors for that reason. This also has been described as taking place on a set of transitive verbs, the description being that the H shows up if and only if the direct object of the transitive verb is non-pronominal. So the root meaning to cross, iut hagatka, gets an H when the direct object is the river, but doesn't have an H when the direct object is pronominal I. So you get iut hagatka versus iagatka. Similarly, the verb to chop up, esitot hawa versus eawa, no H. So already we run into a problem because the generalizations I just told you need a qualification, namely that the second person plural behaves differently from all of the other pronominal prefixes. So the second person plural wad does co-occur with H. So ig, your singular house, versus wadheg, your plural house. And which you can compare it directly to tigiheg. So it looks like a non-pronominal possessor in terms of requiring the H. Similar with verbs, eawa, chop you singular up, wadhawa, chop you plural up. And again, compared to esitot hawa, chop up your foot. So again, wad looks like a non-pronominal object. So the solution that has been advocated for in prior descriptive work on the language is that wad is not in fact a pronoun, but that it's an independent non-pronominal NP. This is kind of a peculiar claim to make because it has pronominal meaning in the sense that it has the meaning of a second person plural, right? So it doesn't behave semantically like a non-pronominal NP. More than that, there's a bigger problem, which is that there's no independent evidence for saying that what is non-pronominal. This contrast of examples from my dissertation is just meant to show you that there are all of these contexts where you get pronominal prefixes attaching either to auxiliaries or to intransitive verbs, or even to the subordinator meaning if or when. And what you'll notice when you compare 46A against 46B is that everywhere you get a first person singular in 46A, you get a second person plural in the exact same set of contexts in 46B. And you can't put a non-pronominal NP in any of these positions other than that of a possessor. So once you take a broader look at the distribution of the pronominal proclitics, or pronominal prefixes, whatever term you prefer, it becomes really clear that saying that wad is non-pronominal is just a restatement of the problem. It's just a restatement of the fact that it co-occurs with H, but there's no independent evidence to say that second person plural wad should be analyzed as something other than a pronoun. So in my dissertation, I drew attention to the fact that when you look at the set of pronominal prefixes, wad is the only one that has a coda consonant. So all of the other ones either end in a vowel or have particular consonantal or semi-consonantal realizations that only occur before a vowel. Wad, however, is the only prefix in the entire set that is of the shape CVC with a consonant coda. So a question which I asked in the thesis and had no answer to at the time I just put the data there and said, I don't have a clue how to analyze these, was that maybe there's something phonotactic going on. I'm going to pursue that line of argumentation today. So part of the argumentation will turn on a set of verbs that were described for the first time in my dissertation. Remember that the traditional description of the Tupai relational prefix relied upon nouns that are possessed and transitive verbs that take a direct object. It turns out that there's a set of intransitive verbs that show the relevant alternation, but for these, there's no way to appeal to syntactic contiguity. The distribution of the H on these intransitive verbs is very clearly phonologically conditioned. So here's an example. Ten kimain ketayero omka. The verb meaning conclude or come to an end is immediately after a vowel final pronominal prefix te, and it shows up as ai. If, however, you put it after an adverbial prefix inside of the verbal complex that ends in an n, you get h. So the contrast is between teai in 10 and tepean ha'i in 11. And it's really difficult to see how the traditional explanation of the relational prefix as something that's inserted in a context of syntactic contiguity could work for 11. The generalization is instead that whenever you have this verbal stem, after a consonant final adverbial prefix, you get the H. So far, I've identified a relatively small set of intransitive verbal roots that show up with this alternation, with the exception of 12E, which has some additional irregularities in its paradigm. All of these verbs behave exactly the same way. Their H shows up if they follow a consonant final adverbial prefix. The language has a small set of those, or the consonant final pronominal prefix what. And I should note that the set of transitive verbs and nominal roots that trigger the H versus 0 alternation is pretty small anyway. So what I've argued is that, or what I've shown you is that there's a set of contexts where it looks like the H is inserted, or rather the H is present following a coda consonant. What I'm going to say now is that this is really, to take this a step further, the H is part of the underlying representation of the stem. And when you see the stem without an H, it's because the H has been lost by a deletion process immediately following one of these 5 pronominal prefixes, all of which are vowel final. So this proposal predicts that we should find additional contexts where H shows up in the absence of any identifiable syntactic contiguity, as that contiguity has been defined in the literature on relational prefixes. We already saw one such context in the case of intransitive verbs. Reduplication provides us with another context. So the verb meaning yawn surfaces as au a after a vowel final pronominal prefix. So 14a is eau anenanye, forgive my American accent when I speak Tuparí. 14b, wadhau anenawara. So the shift from second person singular to second person plural, you get the H. What's really fun is what happens when you reduplicate this verb. So first look at 15a, wau anaunye. Now if you reduplicate it, you get wauhau anaunye, where there's an H in between what looks like, it's hard to tell whether you're getting reduplication to the left or to the right, but either way, you're getting an H in between the two. Now, if you put this verb after the adverbial prefix meaning just, you get weitadhau anaunye. This is in 15b. And if you combine reduplication with the adverbial prefix, you get weitadhau anaunye. So it looks like you're getting the H everywhere you can, except following the pronominal prefix, right? So when you compare 15a through d, the H is everywhere it can be, except when the immediately preceding morpheme is the first person singular or one of the other vowel final pronominal prefixes. So this invites an analysis whereby the H is always there. It's really hard to see why the H would be inserted twice in 15d, but only once in 15c, but makes sense if the H is there but gets deleted. So I would argue that this phonotactic commonality between the consonant final adverbial prefixes and the consonant final second person plural prefix is what explains the disappearance of the H. Another piece of evidence which you all are seeing for the first time, because I only got it confirmed over WhatsApp yesterday, The language has grammaticalized quite a few innovative adverbial prefixes, one of them being the quantificational urut or hurut, meaning two or both. So when this quantificational prefix comes after a vowel final pronominal prefix, as in 16, there's no H, teurut uru ai. And you can compare it to terote eanai, where urut is both or two, and erote seems to be three or more. What's really fun is that if you put this after not a vowel final pronominal prefix, but a consonant final one, you get the H back, just as you do in the independent nominal stem from which this is grammaticalized. So what hurut ora buanerwara, there's an unmistakable H there in between the quantificational prefix inside of the verbal word and the consonant final pronominal prefix. Various morphosyntactic tests will show that hurut in
5 minutes.
Thank you. That show that hurut within the verb in 19, it's really part of the verbal word itself. There's evidence from noun incorporation and other tests. This is really inside of the verbal word. So the distribution of the H in an example like 19 versus an 18 really seems to be because of a consonant right before it. I should note that the second person singular equivalent to 19 also lacks an H. So what hurut ora buanewara with H versus eurut tera buanewara. It's hard because it's a suppletive verbal stem. I can never remember these. All right. So, and again, thank you especially to Isauro and Nilton Tupai for confirming this crucial point, 19, in both the singular and the plural forms for me over WhatsApp. All right, I mentioned at the beginning that Tupai has been described as having 3 different noun classes based upon the distribution of H after non-pronominal possessor and the pronominal prefixes S and I. I argued in my dissertation that the distinction between classes 1 and 2 falls out entirely from phonology. So the S is the pronominal prefix selected prior to a stem that begins with a short oral vowel, and the orthographic I, which can be nasalized to Y, nya, is the elsewhere form. So from ausi, wife, you get sausi, his wife. From apsikum-e, inner ear, you get sapsikum-e, his or her inner ear. From ope, thigh, you get sope, thigh. And then I or Y shows up everywhere else. Patag, ipatag, ema-e, nyema-e, ape, iape, men, imen. So since the distribution of the third person pronominal prefix is wholly predictable on phonological grounds, I think it's incorrect to claim that we're looking at 2 distinct noun classes here, noun classes of the sort that a learner would have to figure out which stem goes into which noun class. It's entirely phonologically predictable. Additional evidence for this claim comes from the verbal phonology. The third person allomorphs have the exact same phonologically conditioned distribution on the verbs as well. So if you have a verbal stem that starts with a short oral vowel like ad becoming sat, oroa, soroa, aptica, saptica, and then orthographic IY is the elsewhere form. Ompo, nyompo, ma'e, ima'e, aptica with an initial glottal stop, I aptica. So if Tupai really did have synchronic noun classes that the learner would have to figure out which stem goes into which noun class, we wouldn't expect the same phonologically conditioned allomorphy to apply in both the nominal and the verbal domains, but it does. So an interesting problem is what happens with these stems that do show up with the epenthetic H, or in my reformulation of the descriptive situation, the unstable H. So what you see is that okio ausi, the man's wife, sausi, short oral vowel. So okio hug, you would expect sag, right? Because it starts with a short oral vowel, but instead you get iag. And I should note that it's not 1 syllable yag, it's 2 syllables, iag. So this root is behaving as if it began with a consonant. And my answer is that it does. It has an underlying H. So the way to state this is simply that the selection of the pronominal allomorph precedes the deletion of the H. So you look at a nominal stem like hug, you say, well, it starts with a consonant, so that gives me ihug, and then I delete the H because it's immediately after a vowel final consonant prefix. And a vowel final pronominal prefix, excuse me. And this takes care of all of the nominal roots, father, son, friend, all of the transitive verbal roots. And it's this particular order of allomorphy selection plus H deletion that gives rise to the surface opacity where we get iag, 2 syllables in slow speech, rather than sag, which is what you would expect. All right, so to summarize, the problems for prior accounts where these are separable relational prefixes are the following. Wad has to be likened to non-pronominal NPs, even though morphosyntactically it has a distribution of all of the other pronominal prefixes. There are intransitive verbal roots that show the H versus nothing alternation following consonant final adverbial prefixes and the consonant final pronominal prefix wad. H shows up in reduplicative contexts like how-a becoming how-how-a, and it also shows up on the adverbial prefix urut or hurut. And finally, the pronominal allomorph selection behaves as if these roots have an H underlyingly at the beginning. The advantage of the present account is that if the H is a stem internal segment rather than a prefix that is inserted in a particular morphosyntactic environment, then basically all of the other problems fall out from that. So I would conclude that the best analysis of the relational prefix is that it's not a separate prefix. We also can abolish the need for synchronic noun classes. They fall out phonologically. Very briefly, I just want to say that comparative work on the Tupian family has taken the Tuparí facts as evidence that Proto-Tupian spoken 4 or 5 millennia ago must have also had relational prefixes. And I'm providing this tree here just to emphasize that the last common ancestor of Tupi-Guarani and Tuparí was Proto-Tupian itself, and that's been part of the logic of the reconstruction. But Sebastian Druda and Sergio Mera have presented extensive evidence that when you look at the Tupi-Guarani branch and its nearest relatives, the prefixes really have to be reconstructed as root initial morphophonological alternations. And I think the same is true for Tuparí. And thankfully, the analysis, the synchronic analysis I've given today of Tuparí is much more compatible with careful reconstructive work, comparative work on the reconstruction of the Tuparían branch than the relational prefix analysis would be. So that's the talk, and I appreciate any and all questions you might have. I can't see the chat. Are there any questions in the chat?
Eu tenho uma pergunta, Adam.
Pode perguntar.
No chat, é a Marina falando. Peraí, deixa eu aparecer.
Oi,
aqui.
Marina.
Sim, tudo bem? Parabéns pela apresentação, muito interessante. Eu queria saber se você, se no Tuparí, eu não sei, existe essa alternância entre 0 e H nas posposições, como acontece na família Tupi-Guarani de maneira geral. Você falou dos nomes e dos verbos e...
Se tem posposições que têm a alternância relevante, eu acho que não existem nessa língua. Eu não conheço nenhuma posposição que exiba a alternância relevante.
Tá, eu pergunto porque nas línguas da família Tupi-Guarani, aquilo que se chama de prefixo relacional acontece nesses 3 ambientes, né? Dentro do sintagma verbal, nominal e posposicional, relacionando o núcleo desses sintagmas com os seus argumentos internos, né?
Eu acho que não tem no Tuparí. Eu diria que a maioria das posposições no Tuparí possui uma etimologia bastante clara. Você vê que tipo tem um substantivo independente que está se convertendo em posposição, mas que eu saiba, nenhum deles tem essa alternância entre H e nada. Mas agradeço muito a pergunta, eu nunca pensei nisso, mas acho que não existe.
Tá certo. Obrigada, Adam. Era isso.
Quem que vai perguntar?
Se não tem ninguém, eu posso fazer minha pergunta?
Pode perguntar.
Parabéns, muito obrigado. Realmente fascinante ver e obrigado a prestar atenção e corroborar, de certa forma, o que Sérgio e eu hipotizamos sobre o Maueti Guarani. Nós não somos os únicos, né? Também o Dani e a Vilaci e outras pessoas que trabalham sobre outras línguas tupi desconfiam que esses prefixos relacionais possam ser explicados como, de fato, certos segmentos iniciais de tema ou de raiz que sofrem certas alterações. Eu acredito que, talvez, em algumas certas línguas tupi-guarani, sincronicamente, uma descrição como prefixo relacional seja possível e talvez até superior a uma análise de ver esses segmentos como parte do tema. Mas, como você muito bem demonstrou, o perigo é de extrapolar para níveis na reconstrução cada vez mais remotos. Inclusive, essa é a minha pergunta. Você tem dado uma olhada para os dados em línguas do macro G, porque já se usa o prefixo relacional, o assim chamado prefixo relacional, para argumentar um parentesco entre línguas G e Tupi. Mas se a gente vê que no Tupi não existe o prefixo relacional, pelo menos não para a reconstrução, então esse argumento de parentesco com as línguas G cai. Não seria isso?
Uma versão mais extensa do PowerPoint que eu mostrei hoje ia falar sobre essa questão da relação entre as línguas tupi e as línguas macro-G. Eu conheço, por exemplo, o trabalho do Andrés, de uns 10 anos atrás, sobre a falta de prefixos relacionais na morfologia das línguas G. Eu acredito que existe uma contradição na literatura atual, porque, tipo, a literatura dos anos 90 diz duas coisas ao mesmo tempo que me parecem contraditórias. A primeira coisa é que a família macro-G é um working hypothesis. Isso foi escrito várias vezes. Mas se é um working hypothesis, então a gente não possui uma reconstrução confiável. Mas se a gente não possui... Isso décadas atrás, eu sei que o André Nicolin fez uma reconstrução lindíssima na tese dele. Só que quando não tínhamos uma reconstrução viável para o tronco macro-G, falar sobre uma relação genealógica mais remota entre o macro-G e o tupi, para mim, não faz sentido. Então, eu até agora não olhei muito os dados das línguas macro-G, mas eu concordo que pode ser que os dados do Tuparí não sejam compatíveis com a história velha de uma relação remota, uma relação genética remota entre os dois troncos.
Perfeito.
Respondi a pergunta?
Sim, respondi.
Eu acabei de tomar um monte de café, então.
Não, foi isso mesmo. Talvez o Andrés ainda tem fatos para contribuir. Não sei.
Eu acho que o André levantou a mão antes do Andrés.
Sim, na verdade, assim, posso falar?
Pode.
Então, não queria me adentrar nessa questão da relação tupi-macro-G, porque acredito que não seja o momento, porque a gente vai ficar 3 horas aqui conversando sobre isso, porque eu acho que eu vou discordar da análise do Sebastian, etc., e acho que não vem ao caso. Mas a pergunta que eu ia fazer é totalmente diferente disso. Eu queria saber se tu tens cogitado a possibilidade de considerar que todos os hiatos na língua poderiam ser representados como vogal, H, vogal.
Como se todos os substantivos na língua?
Tipo, toda sequência de vogais que não tem uma oclusiva glotal lá no meio, se aquilo poderia ser representado, não sei se é possível, se é compatível com os fatos da língua, mas é uma possibilidade que...
Eu não entendi, então, a ideia seria que todos os substantivos têm...
Não os substantivos, todos os hiatos, todos os vogais.
Eu acho que não é possível. A verdade é que H é um fonema super raro na língua Tuparí. parece no início de um grupo de demonstrativos e em contextos de onomatopeia e nos prefixos relacionais e só. Então, talvez seja viável considerar... talvez. Eu nunca pensei nessa possibilidade analítica, mas não me parece não viável, só que preciso pensar mais nela.
Certo. Não é só essa pergunta que eu tinha mesmo. A outra pergunta que eu tinha, já fiz no encontro do Sila. Aí não vou repetir agora. É sobre egg.
Yeah.
Porque... Mas a gente conversa em outro momento sobre isso.
Combinado. Andrés, eu respondi a tua pergunta?
A minha, sim.
O Andrés Salanova.
Não, na verdade, eu só tinha um esclarecimento, mas acho que o Michael tinha uma pergunta antes de mim.
Cadê o Michael?
Opa. Não, tá tudo certo. Acho que o André já perguntou, na verdade. Tá.
Então, eu só tinha queria te pedir um esclarecimento sobre o modificador nominal que tem essa alternância. O que tinha de especial aí? Não entendi bem essa parte da sua argumentação.
Aquele prefixo que significa dois? Ou foi outra...
Acho que sim.
Sorry, we just...
Oh, we're out of time. Yes. So, Andrés, vamos conversar depois, tá?
Beleza.
Muito obrigado pelo feedback. É a primeira vez que eu tenho falado sobre esse assunto num congresso de Amazonianas. Então, é bom conversar com pessoas que conhecem a situação linguística amazônica. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado, Adam. Thank you very much.